Okay, we are finally in chapter 18, the concluding chapter of The Rape of the Mind by Mind.wmv, the psychology of thought control, menticide, and brainwashing, the concluding chapter. Freedom, our mental backbone. The totalitarian state is continually driving out man's private opinions and convictions. For the police state, thinking is already acting. The inner preparation for action, as expressed in trial action, thought, is not accepted. Innate doubt and the trials and tribulations of thought adaptation are denied. Inbreeding destructive thought is one way to undermine the community. Not trusting the liberty of thought and free expression of opinion is even more dangerous. The natural destructive desires are repressed to that uncontrollable realm of the mind that may explode more easily into action. The verbal expression of a destructive thought, however, often partly conquers that thought and renders it less potent. Here lies the actual paradox. Condemning antisocial thought yet not put into action, provokes a short circuit of explosive action. Every piece of logic may have its dangerous implications. Inquisitional murder took place in the service of high ideals. If we cannot gamble with the innate good sense of man, a free and peaceful society are impossible. A democracy is impossible. Moral culture begins and ends with the individual. Only the cult of individual freedom, individual possession, and individual creativity makes man willing to curb instinctual desires and to repress destructivity. Man is not only a social being. Somewhere away from the crowd and the noise, he has to come to grips with himself and confront his God and nature. In order to grow, he needs reserve and isolation and silence. In addition to his mechanical devices and machines, he needs to get back to nature, to camp out of doors by himself. Somewhere along the line, he has to be the maker of some of his own tools, as a shoemaker or a healer or a teacher. Without being thrown on his own and knowing loneliness, man is dwarfed. He is lost among the waves of overpowering human influence and a sea of coercive probabilities. The democratizing action of psychology. The deepest conviction of the power of psychological understanding came to me in my protracted mental struggles with a man who held membership in a totalitarian organization. He came to me for psychological advice during the Nazi occupation of Holland, and I knew that I had to be careful to avoid discussing politics with him. In those days, free expression of opinion could be severely punished, and my patient would have reported me if I had said anything suspicious. However, as my therapy of passive listening liberated him from his personal tensions, the patient became more humane. He developed an increasing respect for the individual personality as such, and sometimes grew very critical of the Nazis' callous treatment of human life and human dignity. As time passed, he disassociated himself more and more from his totalitarian political friends. This was indeed courageous, for, especially at that time, the turn from collaboration towards nonconformism was usually interpreted as high treason. In his last visits, before we agreed that he was cured, we spoke of our mutual faith in the dignity of the individual and our confidence in the decisions of the mature adult as to the path of his own interests. Does psychology really exert a democratizing influence on the authoritarian and totalitarian spirit? The case I have just cited would seem to indicate that it does. On the other hand, we know that Goebbels' propaganda machine applied psychological principles to hypnotize the German people into submission. Hitler, too, laid down his psychological artillery barrage to spread panic throughout Europe. In Nazi Germany, all psychoanalytic treatment was controlled by psychology's own Führer, Goering's brother. Certainly, the science of suggestion, hypnosis, and Pavlovian training can be used to enlist cowardly, submissive followers for a program of despotism. These uses of psychological knowledge are perversions of both the principles and the purposes of psychology. Intrinsic in the psychological approach, and above all in psychoanalytic treatment, is an important element that fosters an attitude diametrically opposite to the totalitarian one. The true purpose of psychology, and especially of its mental health branch, is to free man from his internal tensions by helping him to understand what causes them. Psychology seeks to liberate the human spirit from its dependency on immature thinking so that each man can realize his own potentialities. It seeks to help man to face reality with its many problems and to recognize his own limitations as well as his possibilities for growth. It is dedicated to the development of mature individuals who are capable of living in freedom and of voluntarily constricting their freedom when it is indicated for the larger good. It is based on the premise that when man understands himself, he can begin to be the master of his own life rather than merely the puppet either of his own unconscious drives or of a tyrant with a perverted lust for power. As we have said earlier, every man passes through a stage in his own development of greater susceptibility to totalitarianism. This usually occurs during adolescence when the pubescent becomes aware of his own personality, the authority within himself. In not accepting this responsibility, he may look for a strong leader outside the home. At an earlier age, in infancy, the more unconscious patterns of compulsion and automatic obedience are laid. With the advent of this new sense of selfhood, the youth begins to oppose the adult authorities who previously directed his life. Becoming conscious of the entity we call ego or self, or I, is a painful mental process. It is not a matter of chance that the feeling of endless longing of this is the words in German, Weltschmerz, is traditionally connected with adolescence. The process of becoming an autonomous and self-growing individual involves separation from the security of the family. To achieve internal democracy, the adolescent must separate himself from his protective environment. In doing so, he is not merely intoxicated with his sense of self, the sense of growth and emancipation, he is also filled with a sense of fear and loneliness. He is entering a new world in which he must henceforth assume mature responsibility for his actions. At that time, he may become an easy prey for totalitarian propaganda. A personal grudge against growing up may lead him to forsake the struggle for personal maturity. This problem is particularly acute in Western society, not only because the real ideological political battle we have to face, but also because our ways of raising children may emphasize this problem. Whereas primitive groups impose some measure of social responsibility upon the child early in life and increase it gradually, our middle-class culture segregates him completely in the world of childhood, nursery, and schoolroom, and then plunges him precipitously into adulthood to sink or swim. At this turning point, many young people shrink from such a task. Many do not want freedom that carries with it so many burdens, so much loneliness. They are willing to hand back their freedom in return for continued parental protection, or to surrender it to political or economic ideologies which are in fact displaced parental images. Alas, the youth's surrender of individuality is no guarantee against fear and loneliness. The real outside world is in no way altered by his inner choice. Therefore, the youth who relinquishes his freedom to new parent figures develops a curious dual feeling of love and hate toward all authority. Docility and rebellion, submission and hate live side by side within him. Sometimes he bows completely to authority or tyranny. At other times, often unpredictably, everything in him revolts against his chosen leader. This duality is an endless one. From one side of his nature continually seeks to overstep the limits which his other submissive side has imposed. The man who fails to achieve freedom knows only two extremes: unquestioning submission and impulsive rebellion. Conversely, the individual who is strong enough to embrace mature adulthood enters into a new kind of freedom. True, this freedom is an ambiguous concept since it involves the responsibility of making new decisions and confronting new uncertainties. The frontiers of freedom are anarchy and caprice on the one side, and regimentation and suffocation by rules on the other. And we'll stop right there. This was video 1 of the last chapter of the book, which is chapter 18. We are reading from The Rape of the Mind. See you in video number 2.